All right. Welcome back to our webinar series at Wikistrat. For those of you who don't know, Wikistrat is the largest network of geopolitical experts in the world. And we run not only simulations and geopolitical risk analysis, we also conduct workshops and so on and so on. So if you want to check more about Wikistrat and our services, please log into our website. Today's guest is Dr. Marina Zhang. She's an associate professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute, University of Technology, Sydney. She's a leading expert on critical minerals and rare earth supply chains, including the strategic role of rare earths in the energy transition and in U.S.-China competition. Uh, Dr. Zhang, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe the first question to ask is the big one. Is there a plan at some point in the future, maybe the near future, maybe more into the time where China actually think about closing the supply chains of rare earth minerals? Is that something that the Chinese really contemplate and really think about it from a strategic point of view? In your opinion, is that something that they are actually thinking about doing at some point of time?
Well, China certainly has the capacity of doing so, but whether China has the intention, I'm not quite sure. I mean, processing critical minerals, um, making magnets is a kind of business, and China is making them and largely supply to its own downstream producers. But China does supply to the other countries who want these products for two reasons. And obviously, I mean, that's money making. And second, China can use it to uh, exchange for things China doesn't have. So this is absolutely no intention whatsoever from the government. Government is become less transparent in terms of critical mineral, strategic mineral policies. But so far, I haven't seen China is absolutely closing this supply. And as indicated, China actually paused um, the sanction of supplying rare earths to the U.S.
One of the fascinating points that you make in an article that you published about a month ago in the Diplomat, which is called "Why the West Can't Escape China's Rare Earth Dominance Yet," is the point that China basically see this from a long-term perspective. This is something that their control over earth minerals supply is not something that just happened because they're there. It's something that they build over decades and decades, and that's also how they look into the future. Can you explain a little bit from a strategic point of view, how do you see China's strategy applying when it comes to dominance of this mineral? What are their considerations? What are their objectives in being the ultimate supplier and being in control of this really rare commodity?
It's a kind of um, it's kind of how to say by accident from the very beginning because China is a country which has very severe security concerns of energy because China relies on energy, imported oil, imported coal, and you name it. And in fact, if you look at the list of critical minerals or strategic minerals, most countries call them critical minerals, including the US, EU. EU has its own so-called strategic mineral list. But China doesn't have a critical mineral list. China calls them all a strategic mineral list. So the list is very different from those of the Western countries, including Australians. So China actually names industrial minerals or industrial natural resources like coal, like oil on the list. So that's their critical strategic list. So China from the very beginning and in the 70s, China just by chance found the very rich deposit of light rare earths in Inner Mongolia. And China has educated or trained, was self-trained a few chemists chemists in the top universities, and they started to define separation of all those critical rare earth elements, and then develop industrial capacity of refining and processing them. So this is a long process. I mean, it's really an effort of over decades and quite a bit of investment. And as we know, China has paid huge costs in terms of environmental damage and restoring the environment and develop technologies in waste management, in recycling, and China now, as we know, controls this ecosystem of critical minerals. And we know China actually imports a lot of critical minerals, including from the US for rare earths. So China actually controls this so-called midsection of processing, um, refining, smelting, and that's where China's value added in.
It was fascinating to read your article because I have to say, until I read it, my kind of view of it, of the rare earth minerals aspect, was kind of looking at what the Gulf states are doing with oil. That's what China is doing with rare earth, in the sense that they're basically extracting the mineral and supply it to the world. And that was my thinking before. Then I read your article, and it was fascinating to understand what China did. You use the word ecosystem. They really built an ecosystem that has knowledge. I mean, you talk about in the article about the engineers, thousands of engineers that have a very specific talent here that is not very common outside of China. The regulation that they basically, like you say, they made a sacrifice when it comes on the environment. That's a regulation that we're not going to see in a Western country willing to adopt, unless it's something that they're willing to pay a price, which is not likely. But also the economic side of things, that they're basically building an economy that has a lot of use of it, from, like you said, from renewables to EV and so on. So from that perspective, this is not just a country that is rich with natural element. This is a country that built an entire ecosystem, economic ecosystem, to make them also very, very strategically leading. And this leads me to the question of, is that something that any other country in the world can replicate? Is that something that can be done by anyone else? Or China really has a monopoly here that no one else possesses?
Nobody has a monopoly. I mean, if the other countries using their state power and do it together and invest in 5 to 10 years, and it's obviously they can do it. As I mentioned in the article, this is really the 1980s technologies of chemistry. So, but the thing is, this is just the same as making advanced chips. Is about processing and is about tacit knowledge, which I mean, we as we mentioned, over decades, China has invested so much in every single process component of the process on the value chain, and they all work so smoothly. And mind you, China is the unified market for most of those critical minerals, and China is also uh, and the same um, party rule. So it's much easier for Chinese suppliers and demands, and for all suppliers. I mean, that includes hundreds, not if not thousands, to to work together to collaborate. And you imagine, can you do it with all the suppliers from the EU, from Africa, from Australia, from the US to work together? And you can put a lot of money in it. And you face actually a lot of hurdles, not just financial hurdles, and perhaps a lot of protests from locals because, where you build the refinement plants, the reality is separating all those minerals, rare earth minerals. I mean, they are very, very similar in terms of their chemistry and their physical attributes. To separate them, basically use acid. And, the question is, as I'm working on another article, which is I try to lay out, I mean, what are the overlaps between critical minerals and energy transition minerals? Because fundamentally, if you look at the supply of critical minerals, including rare earth elements, most of them actually are used in downstream industrial purposes. Most of them actually are contributing to to the clean energy transition, less than 1% to the defense. But the rhetoric now by the Western country is because China controls 90% of the supply chain, therefore, this is a country which has different political values from us. Therefore, this is a threat imposing national security threat. But mind you, they only want 1%, but they want to build an entirely different supply chain, independent from China's uh, uh, influence. But with the cost, not just the taxpayers' costs, but also environmental costs and opportunity cost, that probably will delay the energy transition to solar panels, to wind turbines, to electric vehicles. And and that is a bigger cost in my view. So this is really, I think, um, this is we need to ask a very fundamental question. Are we misleading? Are we misled by the Western countries? I mean, you look at what happened at the beginning of this year when Donald Trump, when President Trump met Zelensky in the White House. What he said, well, I mean, basically, he was transforming rare earths into a kind of mineral, the war of minerals. So that is, in my view, politicizing critical minerals. And of course, China is not innocent either. China is using its dominance as a tool of retaliation.
So you kind of lead the way to questions I had written down before our webinar today, and that is, let me put the context here. The topic of rare earth minerals is not new. It's been around for decades, and you mentioned an example which already been applied of a rare earth mineral kind of a blockade, which was the 2010 Chinese basically restricting exports to Japan because of geopolitical tensions between
That's
the two.
correct.
So the topic has been around for 15 years in terms of a geopolitical aspect, but it's been around even for more than that. And
Mhm.
the question is, how much is the new revival of the topic, the renaissance of the topic, like you said, that it's becoming a political topic as much as economic as it was before? How much is that has to do with Trump? How much is that has to do because of the AI boom that we're experiencing in the past few years? How much is that is because of tensions with Taiwan, which are always there in the background? What is the driver? Is it really from the bottom up something that is occurring because we really see a need for that, or is it because there is a top to bottom approach at some point that kind of push for this topic to be on the news and the headlines again?
Oh, that's an excellent question. That is exactly the reason why critical minerals have become leverage used by China, largely in its retaliative efforts against the technological sanctions that actually was imposed during the Trump's first administration. As we know, China was considered a strategic competitor to the US, especially in advanced technologies, and the US started to impose technological sanctions against Chinese leading firms like Huawei, ZTE, and also controls the exports of chip making tools, chip making equipment, and advanced chips to China. So that has forced China to do two things. First, China has to build a closed loop of its own supply demand loop in terms of chip making, and that is obviously very important to power the AI development. That's what you mentioned. And but when China is pushed so hard, and we know in 2023, I think in late 2023, China started to first impose sanctions of two critical metals, not critical minerals, not critical, not rare earths, critical metals, germanium and gallium. Those two, China holds very strong dominance in terms of both deposits and processing capabilities. And those critical metals are critical for web defense purposes. So by then, we know China still didn't use the card of rare earths because rare earths got much broader uh, usage, largely in the clean energy transition areas. But China still didn't touch on that one until last year, early this year, actually, I think when Trump really started the trade war, and China started to use its rare earths card. And even then, China really didn't put the real card, that is China's control of the heavy rare earth elements. So China still actually exporting, I mean, using a license scheme to exporting rare earths for clean energy transition to countries, including Japan and South Korea. Because I actually had talk with people in South Korea, and they are quietly just benefiting their special arrangements license to be approved by China. So it's not a problem. So the countries which actually got a problem is the US.
Now, you mentioned Ukraine in your answer, and in the article you mentioned also actually the interesting point which China is investing a lot into Africa as a supply point for their rare earth minerals, and even had shares in a mining company in the U.S. as part of the supply chains dominance that they do have. So we kind of see a world where more and more countries are trying to offer Trump and the US the idea of we have something to give you from the rare earth. We have this abundance of minerals just lying down underneath our feet here. I mean, there was one question we received before here about Pakistan. There's a question now in the chat about Russia. We know Africa, DRC was a topic that has been discussed about why Trump was so engaged in that as well.
Mm.
Europe and obviously inside the United States, we see the mines there and investment in that. How much are we going into a world where basically we'll see a trend of countries trying to do what China did and invest in their own capabilities of producing those rare earth minerals? One, that's question number one. Two, how much are we going to see a world where consumers, countries who are consumers of the rare earth minerals, are going to try to diversify their supply? So let's start with those who are trying to be the new China, so to speak. How much are we going to go into that? How do you think realistic is that?
That's a very good question. As I think I argued in other articles on rare earths actually is not rare. It's quite abundant, especially light rare earths. So many countries have it, and Mongolia has a lot of deposit. The problem of rare earths in Mongolia is it doesn't have its own processing capabilities. And you cannot just ship rare earths in raw form out of Mongolia without crossing either Russia or China. And China wouldn't allow that. Russia wouldn't allow that. So the rare earths can only sit there unless you can build transportation networks, logistics, processing facilities in Mongolia, in Mongolia. I mean that including electricity. That's not going to happen very anytime soon. And any products from that kind of investment and cannot be justified by small demand from the defense. So China still can leverage by lowering the price to the industrial users because China controls the most of it. And that will make any country who promised to invest billions of dollars, Australia is number one in that game, out of the market. Basically, industrial buyers were not going to spend 5 times more to buy so-called clean China-free mineral supplies or magnets. So because that's not going to accelerate clean energy transition, that's going to delay it. So that's a reality. So why the countries are using this game? Because they know Trump loves it. Trump is a transactional, and they use this as a leverage, including Australia. You see, I got a rare earth card I can play. I can sign a deal with you, and you agree. You will give us money to build facilities, and you offer offtake the prices to buy from us. But really, the reality is that will take 5 years, and the cost cannot be competed with China, and China can always lower the price. So that's in reality um, is doable only to build a very costly supply chain for defense use. I totally agree with that. That's every country should do that because you don't want to be subject to be controlled by a country in defense, right? That's for national security. But as I said, that's that 1% of the demand. And the most demand comes from industrial purposes. Many of them are connected to clean energy transition. And in that sense, we have to ask our questions. China's costs, investment in building these facilities, are they really a national threat or are the assets for clean energy transition? That's, I think, what we need to ask ourselves.
And this is a point I think it's fairly missed in the discussion, and that is that China not only control the supply, 70% of the demand comes from China.
Exactly.
Um, and that means that, as you said, every competitor when it comes to the mining world wants to now extract their own minerals. They have to deal with the fact that 70% of the market is in China. China is doing it in a much cheaper way because of 70%. So they have the scalability working for them as well. And in addition to all of that, they will have to put a sunk cost, which is tremendous, which China already had to go through for 40 years. So it makes basically almost impossible for anyone to basically go through that process in order to get to that level of China. Which leads me to the question here: are we seeing countries maybe doing something else? Which is we saw it with the oil. The United States did it before the fraction revolution, which was the strategic reserves. Are we seeing countries building strategic reserves of rare earth minerals that are not easily can be basically obtained from other suppliers? Do we see this kind of a reserve capability aspects going on, or is that something that's still not taking place?
I think most countries do have this stockpiling strategy, but that's also a very a dangerous, a risky hedge. I mean, what if China decided to lower the price? And then your stockpiled reserves actually will be, I mean, you actually make your final products more of a less cost competitive. So countries have a sort of threshold of doing that. Yeah, I think that's I mean, another point I think we probably didn't mention is many of those critical minerals, including some of the rare earths, actually are byproducts of industrial mining. So which China is again controlling the majority. So you imagine, I mean, in other countries, small country, and you want to get, let's say, 1 kilo critical minerals, but you have to produce um, maybe 1,000 kilos of what other products. What are you going to do with it? But China has the absorptive capacity of those other products first.
But this leads me to the question of what's going on within China, and that is the economy of China. And we saw this with the EVs, with the EV manufacturers, actually, the cannibalism that happens within the economy because the government incentivized so many producers on the
Mm.
one hand, but on the other hand, the market demand wasn't as high to maintain such a market in which so many EV manufacturers and many of them just went bankrupt completely. So it kind of leads to the question of is China in a way artificially maintaining the rare earth minerals production by and all those mines and other capabilities by investing large amount of money into EV technology into and manufacturing into green energy, which they are now definitely the dominant power in the world when it comes to solar and wind and so on. So is that something that we see? Maybe there is a bubble here created by the Chinese government that could actually come into and do a U-turn, and we will have a U-turn situation that will actually hurt the Chinese economy at some point. Do you think that we may be having something of this kind of a dynamics within the ecosystem? Because it's still kind of artificially in a way, or is it really supply demand market rules that are applying here?
That's a very good question. But let's look into this question from a different angle. I mean, Chinese government obviously using all kinds of industrial policies, not enough competitive policies to provide incentives artificially to create competition between different provinces. Each province, most provinces actually have their own sort of pet projects in terms of EV. And you look at it in Shanghai, in Guangzhou, in Shenzhen, in Beijing, in Hefei. And and but this process actually is interesting for Western observers. Their Chinese government using industrial policy, especially subsidies to subsidize those companies. But from internally in within China, you actually see this kind of a neck break competition between them. As you say, China has generated hundreds of EV brands over the past 5 years, and many probably will die. But I mean, if a company, a EV producer, it is dead, well, it has a bankruptcy. What does that mean? I mean, a human died, and your body basically decomposed, and you become fertilizers. But I mean, factory, those workers, experienced workers, or some of the equipment, or even some of the knowledge, actually will not disappear. They will be consolidated into stronger ones. In fact, this is happening. Stronger EV makers, they acquire maybe dying ones, and that will only make the strongest stronger. So then in the end, you see China probably will have maybe a dozen EV producers, and they are providing, I mean, over 50% of the new car market now. And China cannot export its EVs despite its very advanced features and cost advantages. The reason is because this is in China is facing a uphill geopolitical battle, and the export market is not easy, and especially EV is, we all know, is basically a shell on the computer. So how about data a security issue and the data local storage issue? And before those issues, or a battery standards issue, before those issues are solved, China cannot easily produce those EVs. I mean, we're not talking about China exporting really hundreds of thousands of EVs to Germany, but surely countries like Vietnam or in Africa, I mean, locally made cheap EVs actually can help those locals to improve their life, their well-being. I mean, if you look at the mobile phone penetration in African continent, you know what I'm talking about. The total market is controlled by Chinese brands. They're so cheap, but they're providing functionalities of any smartphones can provide. And what
Mhm.
the benefits for locals, children. Before you can have, Bill Gates once said, well, I want to have a netbook. I mean, a trimmed down notebook to every child in the world. But he was not able to do it. But Chinese mobile phone makers actually is providing mobile phones, smartphones with internet connections to many children, many young people in Africa. And they use the mobile phone not only just to settle payments and they're learning, they're conducting
Mhm.
business. And this actually, EV can follow the same mode. I mean, the top brands with advanced features, they probably will be more appealing to high-end buyers, including in China. I was in Beijing last month, and the car I was in, I was just very modern. I mean, you just like you living in the future, basically. So this comes back to the question of is this is a bubble? Is this a bubble? Um, Difficult to say. And if you look at, well, unless another paradigm shift happens, China has
Mhm.
a window of opportunity to consolidate its position and to export the market, export the EV products. I mean, if you look at Germany, I mean, German-made cars, obviously for their locals, but largely for the export markets. Japanese, the same. I mean, why those countries, they're not criticized for oversupplying or overcapacity. And the local market is so small. And Ericsson, a country with what, 8 million people? At one stage, Ericsson was providing 30% of the mobile networks in the world. Nobody said Ericsson was oversupplying, overcapacity.
And I think the question here, from the perspective from a geopolitical angle, is there is there a I wouldn't say a threat, but is there a risk for China to invest so much in its rare earth mineral industry sector? And the risk is that at some point, because demand is so heavily concentrated in internal demand, the risk is that at some point the demand is just not going to be there, and then that may lead to basically having all those sites operating without demand for them, which will lead to a market, I wouldn't say collapse, but definitely a decline. So the question here is this is something that the Chinese government is willing to accept as part of building this kind of economic ecosystem that is completely within its border, or is this is something that maybe because they're trying to motivate suppliers to produce more, and the dynamics of free market, maybe we're going into a point that this is just too much. The question is, are we reaching, like you said, the bubble is in the end, but specifically with rare earth minerals, are we reaching that point where the Chinese companies are at maximum capacity and they might be over reliance on internal demand, and that could actually backfire against them at some point.
Not from what I can see by the operations and by the policies in China. As we know, China has actually consolidated its rare earth suppliers, the mining companies from hundreds to six large ones. Now there are only two state-owned ones. So China actually has been using quotas of production for since 2010, since the instance with Japan. The reason is because China doesn't want to supply too much to the market. So using these mechanisms, China is actually controlling the price. And mind you, China actually is actively investing in alternatives or so-called non-rare earth magnets. And China is also investing, is perhaps in terms of patents, definitely is the leader in the recycling of rare earths. You see, China is actually from all these operations and from the consolidations from the policy perspective, China is not really worried about their oversupplying rare earths. And they don't really, think this is going to be a problem at
Mm.
least for some time.
This is a fascinating point because one of the things you're mentioning here is that China is investing in the possibility of replacing those magnets that are based on those rare, what we call heavy rare earths. You
Yes.
mentioned that also in your articles. We have to make the distinction, and this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you: how vulnerable is the market for disruption? In the sense that new technology will come in, which will require maybe magnets which will allow magnets that don't require those rare earths to replace the ones that we see today. And by that, basically taking any leverage that China has invested so much in having, basically completely gone, because once you have that, you don't really need the rare earth anymore. So how much are we seeing something like that? And it's interesting because you're saying that China is actually looking into that themselves,
Mm,
into those alternatives. So that's something they are thinking about. It's not something that is an hypothesis. It's actually something they invest in researching.
mm. Um, I mean, heavy rare earths, the deposits are limited. And China actually is importing quite a bit of heavy earths from Myanmar, from some from Australia and the US, because China it controls almost China has almost a monopoly in terms of producing heavy rare earths enabled permanent magnets. So those things, I mean, unless we are seeing a technological paradigm shift, I mean, the reality is that is not going to be replaced anytime soon. But we know the demand for this kind of very heavy rare earth magnets actually is very small. It's not big. So China is controlling it.
And do we see that there is an attempt by governments that are not China to
Mm.
find a replacement to those products that are basically dependent on those rare earths? Do we see this idea to disrupt the market by innovation and technology? Do we see some sort of investment in that?
Oh yeah, including China, South Korea, Japan, US, EU. Guess every country is looking into this alternative substitute technologies which can replace heavy reliance on rare earths.
And do we see any progress in that? Anything that could kind of be a signaling to the wave to come, or are we still far, far away from that?
I think we're still far away from that. I mean, but you never say no to anything like this. I mean, once the let's just look at example of lithium batteries, and I mean, once the industry held this position that cobalt was
Mm.
essential to high density um, batteries, but then the industrial innovation actually reduced the
Mm.
reliance on cobalt. And then nickel uh, became a issue, and Chinese company actually has invested and innovated technologies so that the lithium batteries actually is not using that much nickel. So they're
Mm.
using more magnesium. Magnesium, as we know, in natural deposit is much more, and the processing is cheap. So we can see this kind of um, constant technological movement. So we don't know what's going to happen, but so far we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it. We know, I mean, for American jet fighter, whatever that F-35. I mean, you need 400 kilos of magnets. Um, I mean, we haven't found any evidence that supports without those kind of supplies, they can fly those jets.
Mhm. And it's interesting to see how we're living in a world that globalization post fall of USSR that exploded connected us in a chain of so many commercial networks that allow an F-35 to be using Chinese rare earth, heavy rare earth minerals in its production. And that leads to the question. I mean, we are living in an era where some people are saying we're no longer in the globalization period. That's a different discussion, but let's go with that. We are in the, some people say, balkanization slash the bloc slash the basically the kind of closing of the market in a sense, and that was accelerated by COVID, Russia, Ukraine, and so on. So from this perspective, how vulnerable are we to a world where basically China decides to cut the supply because of and leave it only for specific blocks of countries? Is that something that would completely turn off the or completely upset the economies of the economies connected to China in their supply, or is that something that's going to be that they can maybe it's going to be like an earthquake, but they can sustain it and live through it?
Some funny noise. As I mentioned from the very beginning, the first question you asked, China has a capability, but whether China has the intention, that's totally different matter. And the reality is, China is not entirely um, free from vulnerability in terms of supply chains. The nature of global supply chain over the past before the first before the trade war between US and China started was that, well, we're living in an interdependent ecosystem. So if you look at what happens to coffee you drink every day, I mean, the coffee beans actually traveled 7 times in the world before reaching you final consumers, 7 different countries. So that's the whole plantation, harvest, processing, or whatever, packaging, 7 countries. So that explains global supply chains. While we're paying attention to China's dominance of mineral processing, as I said, China is vulnerable in terms of importing some of the critical minerals. For example, nickel from Indonesia, right? Cobalt from Congo, and even heavy rare earths from Myanmar. And it just happens that China develops these midstream processing capabilities. So that makes China a threat. But, and if you look at the rare earths as a block, if it is upper supplier to the technology supply chain that starts from, let's say, the ASMOS lithographic machine for chip making, right? China still relies advanced technologies in semiconductor industry. So when China, I can't remember which article, I think it's an article published recently by The Economist, basically all the Financial Times, I can't remember the details. There are several articles suddenly, recently, they start to talk about this. If China is dominating all industrial outputs, and what can we make? That's that kind of question. So I was thinking about this question. I said, I talked to my colleagues in China. I said, if China is walking on the road, I mean, walked by others before, I mean, what options you leave to the others? And my colleagues, I mean, including professors from top universities, what they say, you see, China is still waiting, is still relying on imports of advanced technologies and ideas from Germany, from the US, and they're willing to pay for it, pay the licensing fee, and translating those advanced ideas into industrial outputs. So that's comes back to the fundamental economic principle, comparative advantages and competitive advantages. Those things, well, China happens to have more engineers, more um, land for building plants, and in old days, less relaxed, less strict environmental policies. So that build those kind of capabilities. And the reality is, can you do it in India? And how about land rights? And how about you have to spend a generation of educating those engineers, which China did since the 1990s. So this comes back to my point. So if we look at this from the national security perspective, the concentration of China on this component of the global supply chain for technology is a threat. But maybe we should change the lenses we use to look at China.
So that leads me to the question: if we do change the lenses and we look at
Yeah.
China's dominance when it comes to the market of rare earth minerals, from the perspective which is more basically equal to that, like you mentioned, Germany for with cars for export, Sweden, Ericsson, technological, and so on. Um, when we approach China from the lens of the economy,
Mm.
what is China doing today that you would say maybe will kind of open up its market to investors who would like to invest in China? Is that something that you think will be something that they will agree to? Investing, I mean, in the rare earth mineral sector, not investing in China in general. Or they're still looking at it as from a perspective of no, those six companies that you mentioned, those are six companies that are government owned and we're not going to open that market. So do you see any potential? Because the webinar here, we're looking in the future. So do you see any potential of China opening up their internal market for external actors who are not maybe governments, but private sector actors, i.e., for example, companies such as BHP or Rio Tinto or something like that, to come in and invest in China when it comes to rare earth minerals production and so on?
That's a very good question, and I really don't know the answer. And I can't predict political landscape in China. That is, as we know, changeable. And the focus today is on state-owned enterprises. Tomorrow is on private enterprises, and switch back. I mean, it's quite hard. But what one thing I know is I just finished a report actually a study on China's on the Australian-China free trade agreement. In which I talked to business people, including a few Western miners, leading ones, and they're retired, obviously. So they mentioned something in the interview that was quite interesting. So they offered when China didn't have enough exploratory technologies of mines, they offered to help China to explore vast west or whatever areas. What the local officials said, well, actually, you welcome to help us, but I can tell you, the government policy is such that you cannot benefit from any mines you find in China. So
Mm.
that's the point. I don't think this has changed yet. So even because that gives very little incentives to foreign investors to get into this field.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I don't think Chinese uh, investors, including government, is having any ban against those even state-owned enterprises to invest, to go abroad. So that's actually a
Mm,
slogan, as we know, China has been promoting for some time. Uh, the problem of those China state-owned investors are facing today is geopolitical hurdle. Because first of all, the host countries actually have much strict scrutiny against the Chinese investors, especially state-owned enterprises. So, and second, um, there are very high compliance costs for those companies if they invest in other countries. So how they
mhm,
solve this problem, that's a problem. So but I mean, this is just from my research, and I provided kind of, business strategies or policy recommendations. What if a few countries, if they're located together, and they can form an alliance to work together with China, and China is making investment, not just money, and but also can license technologies and to supply certain market or demand with specific purposes. And that is totally possible. I mean, in this way, for those countries, let's say ASEAN countries, you don't need to invest from scratch how to separate all those rare earth elements. You don't need to go through the try and error innovation to find the best recipe of whatever chemical um, engineering um, to find the best recipe to do those kind of smelting and refining. And you can license technology from China. We know that China has the majority of the patents in this area. And
mhm,
why, for human beings, we living on the planet together, and you have to say, okay, because China is different, we're not going to use this technology. I think about in the 90s and 80s and 90s, China used many technologies from the West. We know that. That's how China started its industrialization. And when the coin flipped, why can't China's technologies being adopted?
mhm.
Simply because
And
they're
this
different.
and this goes into back into the geopolitical tensions and the geopolitical situation and within the framework of U.S. China competition, great power competition, obviously. So we are entering the last 5 minutes of our webinar. The tradition is always to go into the scenarios that we like to ask in the last 5 minutes, and that is your best case scenarios when it comes to rare earth minerals. Best case in terms of the market basically flourishing and open, and there's no supply disruption of any sort. Worst case scenario, what could happen that could lead to market disruption and what kind of a market disruption? And the black swan, i.e., low likelihood but high impact potential event that could completely change the whole thing. So let's start with the best case scenario. So we're in a period where rare earth minerals are back at the top of the agenda when it comes to policy making. What could be the best case scenario for rare earth minerals supply in the coming future, let's say the next 5 years?
The best case scenario, I think, is I agree. I mean, if we look at EU's policy, that is, you cannot rely on any third country which controls 60% of the supply. So China has to reduce its control to that threshold, let's say, and that will ease the concerns from many countries that China will use it. So as long as there are some alternative suppliers, I mean, we're living happily together. Uh, so this is a best scenario, but can we reach it? Can we achieve this? Uh, I doubt it in the next 5 years because, as I said, as I argued in the Diplomat article, I mean, the West is still relying on China. It yet, it's not getting rid of China yet. So, the point is, it takes time to do this. But meanwhile, and if there is no significant black swan events such as earthquake or nature disasters, another pandemics, or completely trade war separating China from the rest of the world, China probably will continue supplying the rare earths and products to industrial uses. I don't see China has any incentives of cutting off. Uh, but for defense purposes, that's totally different matter.
And from a worst case scenario, what could you think could be a worst case scenario when it comes to supply of rare earth minerals? And I'm trying to evade the whole China Taiwan here, just because it's such a highly discussed. So, but what would you say would be the worst thing that could happen from a perspective of the next 5 years that will harm, not necessarily pause, but harm supply of rare earth minerals into today's markets?
Well, won't be beautiful, I can tell you. And that means we will perhaps will decouple the technological systems or ecosystems. So China will not go alone, but China will build its alliances with the global south. And China has been doing this already in infrastructure, in information, in standards, in products. And the other camp is obviously the Western democratic countries. So that is not going to be good. The reason is for China and the China-led camp, um, there will be a time lag in terms of getting access to advanced technologies, some of them. Uh, but they can have good enough products to be self-sustainable. For the West, and they will develop their own supply chains, maybe from scratch, but with very high cost. So that's not going to solve the problems of inflation most countries are facing today. And the worst and the worst scenario of the worst scenario is there's no interconnections between the two camps. And that means people from China perhaps cannot travel to a Western country and use their systems easily. So that's maybe the worst and the worst scenario.
And last but not least, and that is the black swan scenario. What can you kind of think creatively could be a low likelihood but a high impact event that could impact supply or demand in any way or form, i.e., demand increasing, decreasing, same thing goes for supply.
Oh, as you mentioned, Taiwan is a thorny issue. And if both parties, well, multiple parties in the region, including the US, Japan, China, if any party is not using the diplomat power wisely and they lose control and the situation escalates, that's going to be a devastating event. As we know, Taiwan does control um, the majority of the um, semiconductor chip making.
Perfect. So I think this is basically the point where we say goodbye. This has been fascinating, very interesting, both in terms of the discussion, but also in terms of some of the insights that were provided here. I really enjoyed the discussion itself, and it was fascinating. I want to thank everybody who joined us today and logged in for our webinar today. There's a series of more webinars coming up ahead next month and in January as well. Um, Dr. Marina Zhang, thank you so much for joining us today and for the insight you provided. Much appreciated. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you for having me.